A single iron bucket clatters against the stone wall of a village well, the sound cutting through a street that should be alive with voices but is now choked by a heavy, expectant silence. In the winter of 1348, the greatest threat to humanity was no longer the invisible shadow creeping through the ports. It was the sudden, sharp look in a neighbor's eyes. A single question had begun to circulate, carrying a weight heavier than any fever. If the world is ending and the heavens are silent, who among us has pulled the trigger? Within weeks, the search for a cure was abandoned in favor of a search for a culprit, turning every shadow into a conspirator and every well into a potential crime scene. This is the chronicle of how a continent's psyche fractured before its walls did, and the realization that when logic vanishes, the human instinct for survival demands a sacrifice. The year did not begin with the visible chaos of war, but with the eerie stillness of an abandoned harbor. Ships drifted into the docks of the Mediterranean with their sails tattered and their crews slumped over the oars, unable to utter a final warning. It was a mystery that defied the era's understanding of the physical world. In the 14th century, life was a clockwork of tradition, governed by the rhythm of the church bells and the predictable cycle of the harvest. But as the great affliction moved inland, that clockwork shattered. The vibrancy of the marketplace was replaced by the frantic scribbling of scholars who had no answers and the hushed prayers of leaders who saw their influence thinning by the hour. The unknown was a burden that the collective mind of the era simply could not carry.
Look at her
When
fancy
people are
dress while
faced
we
with a
starve.
disaster that has no face,
It's her
they will
fault the
eventually
crops
carve
failed.
one
Get her
out of
out
the
of
people
here.
standing nearest to them.
Heave!
As
Push
the months
harder.
grew colder, the atmospheric pressure
Run,
in the
get
walled
inside the walls
cities
now.
reached a fever pitch. There is a specific kind of tension that builds when a society feels it is being punished for a crime it hasn't committed. In the vacuum of scientific explanation, suspicion began to grow like mold in a damp cellar. It started with a sidelong glance at the gate, a sudden interest in why certain households seemed to be cleaning their doorsteps more frequently, or why the residents of the isolated quarters were still drawing water from the same sources as everyone else. In the medieval mind, nothing happened by chance. If the air was heavy and the water tasted of iron, it wasn't viewed as a natural phenomenon. It was interpreted as an intentional act of malice. The need for a visible enemy became a psychological necessity, a way to reclaim agency in a world that felt increasingly random. The rumors arrived before the sickness did, traveling along the trade routes like a secondary infection. The narrative was chillingly specific. It was whispered that a secret network had conspired to alter the wells, the very heart of communal life. In an age where the public fountain was the center of the social universe, the idea that the water had been turned into a weapon was enough to spark a wildfire of hysteria. The finger of blame did not point toward the sky or the shifting stars, but toward those who had always lived on the margins. The people who spoke different tongues, followed different ancient laws, and remained separate from the dominant social fabric. To the terrified masses, the survival of these groups became an indictment. If they weren't falling at the same rate, the logic went, they must hold the antidote. The psychological landscape of 1348 became a hall of mirrors, where fear acted as a hallucinogen, turning the mundane into the monstrous. A person seen walking alone at night wasn't just a traveler, they were perceived as a courier of doom. A merchant selling foreign spices wasn't just a trader, they were seen as a chemist of shadow. In cities like Basel and Strasbourg, the local authorities found themselves standing on a crumbling bridge between the rule of law and the rage of the collective. The conflict was no longer a struggle against a biological threat, but a civil war between the panicked and the perceived. The records of the time suggest that the logic of the court began to bend under the weight of the street. If a confession could be extracted through the application of shadow and iron, then the source of the evil could finally be given a name and set aside. By the time the winter of 1349 arrived, the air in the Rhine Valley was thick with more than just the chill of the river. The city was a powder keg of grief and accusation. The local council attempted to hold the line, pointing out the lack of evidence and the sheer impossibility of the charges. But their voices were drowned out by the roar of the guilds and the desperate demands of a citizenry that felt abandoned by the divine. The narrative of the poisoned wells had become a dark gospel. It offered something the doctors couldn't, a target. It offered a way to fight back against the darkness, even if that fight meant destroying the very foundation of their community. The pressure became a physical force, a vibration in the cobblestones that signaled the end of diplomacy and the beginning of a much darker reckoning. When the day of judgment finally came, it was a systematic dismantling of the social contract. The descriptions left behind by those who watched from their windows are devoid of clinical detachment. They speak of structures being built in the centers of the cities, not for shelter, but for a final, terrible accounting. There was a frantic, misplaced energy in the air, a belief that by removing the other, the air would be purified and the shadow would recede. Those who had lived as neighbors for generations, who had traded bread and shared stories, were suddenly separated by an unbridgeable chasm of suspicion. As the torches were lit, the smoke that rose over the rooftops was seen by some as a signal of salvation, a desperate attempt to burn away the uncertainty that had paralyzed their world. The tragedy of the scapegoat was not a localized event. It was a pattern that repeated itself with devastating precision across the continent. From the banks of the Danube to the coastal towns of the south, the mechanism was identical. A profound sense of powerlessness led to the dehumanization of a minority. The other became a vessel for all the grief, anger, and terror that the population could not process. By projecting the source of the misery onto a tangible group, the survivors felt a temporary sense of control. They felt they were finally doing something, reclaiming their lives from the invisible enemy, even as they committed a mistake that would haunt the architecture of history for centuries. The irony was suffocating. As they sought to protect their lives by eliminating the poisoners, they were succumbing to a much more potent toxin of the mind. The aftermath of these events left the social landscape as scarred as the physical one. When the shadow of the great affliction finally began to recede, it revealed a world that was fundamentally broken. The communities that had been decimated were gone, but the memory of the internal violence remained, etched into the silence of the town squares. Some leaders tried to restore a semblance of order, issuing decrees that forbade the blaming of the innocent, but the damage was irreversible. The trust that holds a civilization together had been incinerated. The survivors were left to look at the empty wells and the silent houses of their former neighbors and ask themselves the most haunting question of all. If the wells were never poisoned, what was it that truly turned the community into a storm of blades? Looking back through the lens of history, the events of 1348 serve as a grim reminder of the fragility of human reason under pressure. It highlights a recurring flaw in the human condition, the tendency to seek a person to blame for a systemic catastrophe. The invisible nature of the threat was its most potent weapon, not just because of the toll it took on health, but because of the toll it took on the collective soul. It forced a choice between the difficult path of logic and the easy path of the torch. In the darkness of that era, the torch seemed to offer more warmth, even if it was burning down the house of the person holding it. The tragedy was not just in the loss of life, but in the total surrender of the values that define a shared society. The question that remains for us today is how thin the veneer of our own stability actually is. Even in a modern world saturated with data and technology, we see the same echoes of the past during every crisis. The search for a culprit, the rapid spread of unverified narratives, and the sudden sharp divide between us and them are patterns that did not die out in the Middle Ages. They are dormant, waiting for the next moment of profound uncertainty to resurface. The story of 1348 is not just a chronicle of a distant era. It is a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of the mind, showing us how quickly we can abandon our humanity when we feel the shadow of the unknown at our backs. We are often more afraid of our neighbors than we are of the disasters that haunt us both. In the end, the real poison wasn't in the wells. It was in the fear that bypassed the intellect and went straight to the survival instinct. It was in the stories told in the dark, the whispers that grew into shouts, and the tragic realization that the most dangerous thing in a time of crisis isn't the threat itself, but how we choose to see each other in its presence. The ruins of the old quarters and the silent records of the lost generations stand as a testament to what happens when we let the shadow of suspicion replace the light of empathy. We are left with the silence of the aftermath, the empty wells, the rebuilt walls, and the ink on parchment are all that remain of a time when the world lost its way. The cycle of fear and blame is a wheel that has turned many times. From the ancient world to the medieval period and into the modern era, the pattern is unmistakable. I told you it wouldn't work. When we are confronted with the inexplicable, we are tempted to create a narrative that restores our sense of control. But as the events of the 14th century show, a narrative built on fear is a narrative built on sand. It may offer a moment of relief, but the cost is always a piece of our collective conscience. The mystery of the scapegoat is not just a historical curiosity. It is a living question that we must answer every time we are faced with a crisis. How do we treat the stranger when the world is falling apart? How do we verify the truth when the air is thick with accusations? As the sun sets on the stories of the past, the lesson remains carved into the foundation of our history. It is a lesson about the danger of certainty in an uncertain time. The shadow may return in different forms, as a disruption of health and economic collapse or a social upheaval, but the choice of how to respond will always be ours. Will we reach for the torch of blame, or will we hold fast to the common thread that binds us all, even in the deepest dark? The records of that era remain a puzzle, a series of fragmented accounts that describe a world pushed to its absolute limit. No single explanation covers the breadth of the tragedy. It remains a dark thriller of the human experience, a mystery that doesn't have a clean resolution. The most terrifying thing isn't what hides in the shadows, but what the shadow brings out in the heart of the community. If we listen closely to the echoes of 1348, we might hear a warning for our own time, a warning to look past the easy answers and the convenient targets. We must remember that when the air grows heavy and the streets fall silent, the most important thing we can protect is our sense of justice and our shared humanity. For once those are gone, the darkness has already won, regardless of whether the physical threat remains or fades away into the night. It is a story without a hero, only survivors and those who were lost. It is a reminder that the greatest threat to civilization is not a disruption of nature, but the moment we stop seeing each other as people and start seeing each other as problems to be solved. And that is a mystery that each generation must solve for itself before the first torch is lit. The legacy of the empty wells is not just one of death, but of a profound silence that followed. When the panic subsided and the realization dawned that the actions taken had not stopped the tide of the affliction, a heavy guilt settled over the continent. The architecture of the cities changed. Walls were built higher, but the internal walls between people were built higher still. We see the remnants of this era in the very layout of European towns, in the names of streets that no longer house the people they were named for, and in the laws that were eventually drafted to prevent such a collapse of reason from happening again. Yet the question remains, are we any more immune to the poison of suspicion today than they were then? Ultimately, the events of the mid-14th century highlight the thin line between civilization and chaos. It took only a few months of uncertainty to undo centuries of communal progress. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the power of the narrative. Whoever controls the story of why we are suffering holds the power to direct the survival instinct of the masses. In 1348, that power was seized by fear and directed toward the innocent. As we move forward into our own uncertain futures, the challenge is to ensure that the stories we tell are rooted in truth and compassion, rather than the desperate need for a culprit. The clatter of that iron bucket against the well wall still echoes, a haunting reminder that the water we share is only as pure as the trust we have in one another.